It is the year 2012. Frustrated by the direction the Church is taking, Cardinal Bergoglio requests permission from Pope Benedict to retire. However, Pope Benedict summons his critic and future successor to Rome. The two will engage in lengthy conversations in an effort to find common ground. Behind the Vatican walls, there will be a deep debate between tradition and progress, with the goal of shaping a future for the millions of Catholic faithful around the world. In addition, Benedict will reveal a secret that would shake the foundations of the Catholic Church, as he surprised the world when he announced his resignation from the papacy. It all begins with a phone call, in which a man tells the operator that he wants to purchase a ticket from Rome to Lampedusa. Although he is aware he could book it online, he has recently moved and decides to use this method instead. When asked for his name, he responds that he is Jorge Bergoglio. The person on the other end of the line mentions that he shares his name with the Pope, which makes him smile. She then asks him for his postal code, to which he replies that he doesn't know it, as he is in Vatican City. The operator, finding the situation amusing, tells him that it's very funny and hangs up, thinking the call was a prank. In Buenos Aires, in the year 2005, we see a priest delivering a religious sermon. He tells the story of Francis, a young man who one day entered a chapel in ruins and believed he heard a voice saying, "Francis, repair my church." He also speaks of a God who does not judge them, a God who enjoys football and understands the fatigue and poverty they face. After finishing his sermon, and as he walks through the streets, a woman approaches him to inform him of the death of Pope John Paul II, plunging the world into mourning. Meanwhile, in Vatican City, preparations are underway for the conclave that will choose the new pope. The remains of John Paul II are transferred with solemnity. John Paul II was a fervent defender of human rights, committed to the fight for the underprivileged, and sought unity between different faiths. His papacy also marked the end of liberalization, leading to a return to the Church's rejection of homosexuality, abortion, contraceptive methods, and the ordination of women and married men. Next, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, one of the main candidates, walks through the halls of the Vatican with his advisor, who presents him with the profiles of possible successors. He shows him a photo of the Archbishop of Kiev, Cardinal Hussar, as well as Cardinal Arinze from Nigeria. Many believe the latter could become the first African pope. He then shows him an image of Bergoglio, originally from Argentina, known as a strong advocate for reform and very popular in various circles. Outside the Vatican, the media speculate on the process. 115 cardinals from 52 countries have been praying to choose a new pope. These cardinals are not only spiritual figures, they are also shrewd politicians. The choice appears to be between the conservative German Joseph Ratzinger and the Italian reformist Carlo Maria Martini, who represents a more progressive change. Ratzinger, as a key figure in the Vatican for some time, is seen as the logical successor to John Paul II. Meanwhile, Ratzinger and Jorge Bergoglio find themselves in a restroom washing their hands. Jorge, in a carefree mood, is whistling a tune. Intrigued, Ratzinger asks what he's humming. Bergoglio responds that he's whistling Dancing Queen, a famous song by ABBA. Later, the cardinals gather in a formal setting to discuss various matters. Upon entering, Jorge Bergoglio is struck by the beauty of the place. Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini tells him that churches in Europe are truly beautiful, but sadly, they are empty. Martini insists that change is necessary, authentic reforms, and expresses his belief that Bergoglio might be the right person to bring them about. However, Bergoglio laughs and assures him that he is not the one for such a responsibility. Ratzinger, for his part, maintains a distant attitude toward Bergoglio, while interacting more warmly with other cardinals. This dynamic suggests underlying tensions between the candidates. The voting process begins with solemnity. The cardinals enter the Sistine Chapel under the watchful eye of the media, who explain the rules of the conclave. If a new pope is chosen, white smoke will rise from the chimney. Otherwise, the smoke will be black. Each cardinal writes down the name of the candidate they wish to see as the next pope. A 2/3 majority is required to be elected, meaning 77 votes in total. Finally, the results are revealed. Ratzinger receives 47 votes, Bergoglio 10, and Martini 9. No one achieves the necessary majority. What stands out, however, is that Bergoglio, a cardinal from Latin America, has received 10 votes. No one had anticipated this. During lunch, Humes, one of the liberal cardinals, confides to Bergoglio that Martini has asked his supporters to transfer their votes to him. Bergoglio is stunned by this revelation, as he does not want the position. Bergoglio's allies argue that a true leader does not seek power, and they believe Ratzinger is not the right choice precisely because he desires it so strongly. For them, the Church faces a fundamental problem: the rigidity of an unchanging truth that prevents it from adapting to modern times. As the next round of voting takes place, a winner is declared: Ratzinger. He's dressed in the white cassock, a jewel-encrusted cross, a velvet cape, a ring, and finally, the red shoes. Thus, the new pope presents himself to the crowd, taking on the role as the representative of Jesus on earth. Ratzinger, filled with joy, waves to the crowd and is introduced to the world as Pope Benedict XVI. While some see his election as a victory for church unity, others interpret it as the consolidation of a conservatism that could alienate younger believers. Inside the Vatican, Humes and Bergoglio are disappointed, as the Church has just voted to continue without enacting the much-needed reforms. Jorge loses faith in the hierarchy, and even considers renouncing his title of cardinal to return to being a simple priest, believing he could make more of a difference from that position, aware that as things stand, he will not be able to change anything. We are then shown various public opinions about the new pope. Some support him for his defense of dogma and conservative stance, while others even go so far as to label Benedict XVI a Nazi due to his German ancestry. Now we move to the year 2012. Jorge has returned to Buenos Aires, where he leads a simple life. He is determined to resign from his post as cardinal and sends his resignation to the Pope. However, the Pope responds with a letter suggesting he traveled to Rome to discuss it in person. Jorge tells the woman delivering the letter that he had already booked his flight long before receiving it. This confuses the woman, until she realizes that Bergoglio plans to step down from his position. Nevertheless, she tells him that the Vatican needs him now more than ever. Jorge reflects aloud, noting that he had already requested a meeting before receiving these letters. The woman comments that this is quite a coincidence, but he replies that to him, nothing is a coincidence. Everything is in God's hands. Soon, the media report that the Vatican is undergoing a deep crisis. Financial scandals and inappropriate conduct have come to light, culminating in the arrest of the Pope's right-hand man. His classified file has only been read by Benedict XVI. Meanwhile, we see Jorge preparing to travel to Rome, fully aware that his presence is required at a crucial moment for the Church. Upon arriving in the Eternal City, Jorge is met by a driver who will take him to the Pope's summer residence. Before they depart, he chooses to sit in the front seat, a gesture that symbolizes humility. During the ride, the driver comments that the Pope prefers to see him dressed as a cardinal, suggesting that this meeting will not be informal. Upon arrival, Jorge must wait until the Pope is ready to receive him. While waiting, he hears someone whistling in the distance and soon realizes it's the gardener. He strikes up a friendly conversation with him, mentioning that the smell of oregano plants reminds him of his beloved mother. When the Pope finally notices Jorge's presence, he begins the conversation by recalling that the last time they met, they spoke in Latin. Jorge admits he doesn't speak it well, but Benedict XVI assures him that Latin is useful. He uses it to deliver bad news to cardinals. Only about 20% get upset, since only that percentage understands what he says. He then apologizes for making him wait, aware of Jorge's punctuality. He also mentions Paulo, his assistant, who would have ensured his timely arrival and is perfect at his job. Jorge replies with a smile that Paulo is now in prison. The Pope then asks if Jorge wrote to him requesting permission to retire as Cardinal Archbishop. Jorge confirms and presents his documents. The Pope reminds him that cardinals can't request retirement until they turn 75 and asks if he is ill. Jorge responds that he has lung issues, to which the Pope replies that he already knows. He was born with that condition, but it hasn't significantly affected him. It's noted in his file. The Pope also mentions that Jorge sometimes uses a bicycle, which indicates he's in good health. Jorge nods and adds with a smile that he also dances tango. The Pope asks if tango is a dance. Jorge confirms, proudly noting that he is Argentine. The Pope asks if he dances with someone, and Jorge says yes. One looks ridiculous dancing alone. So, for professional dignity, he always dances with a partner. The Pope jokes that Jorge has been one of his harshest critics and acknowledges that there's fierce competition for that title. Jorge defends himself, saying he never spoke against the Pope. Benedict replies that not directly, but points out his refusal to live in the official palace of the cardinal archbishops. Jorge agrees, arguing that it's too grand and excessive. The Pope says that by being so pure and simple, Jorge makes it seem as though others are not. Jorge wonders if it's truly possible to live in such simplicity. The Pope then shifts the conversation to the topic of married priests. Jorge clarifies that he was misquoted. He only said that celibacy can be both a blessing and a curse. Finally, the Pope asks about homosexuality. Jorge replies that he was also taken out of context on that matter. The Pope advises him to tell newspapers the opposite of what he really thinks, so he'll be quoted accurately. Jorge concludes by expressing his belief that communion is not a reward for the virtuous, but food for the hungry. The Pope nods, reflecting on the importance of Jorge's beliefs compared to the traditional teachings of the Church over centuries. Jorge responds by saying it's not about opposing tradition. He then quotes a passage from the Bible, Mark 2:17. "I came to call sinners, as the Church has taught for thousands of years." The Pope suggests that if they don't build barriers or walls, it will lead to chaos. Jorge interrupts and asks whether Jesus built walls. His face radiates mercy as he declares that the greater the sinner, the warmer the welcome. Mercy is the dynamite that blows up walls. At that moment, the Pope's clock chimes, reminding him to go for a walk on his doctor's recommendation. They begin walking, and the Pope asks Jorge if he believes the Church is failing. Jorge replies that they are losing followers. The Pope questions whether that's the Church's fault or the result of Western relativism in today's permissive culture, the mindset that everything goes. He also reminds Jorge that he once said the Church was narcissistic, or that's what was quoted. Jorge confirms he did say it. He feels the Church is moving in directions he can no longer accept, or worse, not moving at all when the world demands it. He no longer wants to be a salesman for a product he cannot genuinely believe in. The Pope asks if there is something Jorge doesn't believe in. Jorge says he feels they're no longer part of this world. They're disconnected from its essence. The Pope replies that a church that embraces today's spirit will be widowed tomorrow. He recalls that when he was the superior of the Jesuits in Argentina, he removed all Marxist books from the library. Jorge also mentions that he made seminarians wear cassocks all day, even when working in the vegetable garden, and believed same-sex marriage was a scheme of the devil. The Pope says that's no different from what he himself experienced. Jorge then explains to the Pope that priests didn't practice celibacy until the 11th century, and as for angels, there's no mention of them before the 5th century. Yet suddenly, they appear everywhere like doves. In nature and the universe, nothing is static, not even God. The Pope responds, God doesn't change. Jorge replies, yes, he does. As they walk, the Pope asks where one finds God if he is always in motion. Jorge answers, you find him on the road. The Pope says that it's Jorge's ego speaking, suggesting he thinks he knows more than everyone else. Jorge, with an ironic smile, reminds him that he's Argentine and jokes, how does an Argentine commit suicide? He climbs to the top of his ego and jumps off. The Pope tells him to keep walking. Perhaps they'll find God along the way. Then the Pope mentions that they're defending 2,000 years of tradition. But Cardinal Bergoglio seems to know better than all of them. Jorge insists that's not true. In recent years, they've punished anyone who thought differently on issues like divorce, contraception, and homosexuality. While the planet was being destroyed and inequality grew like a cancer, they debated whether Mass should be in Latin or if girls could be altar servers. They built walls around themselves, but the real danger always came from within. The Pope asks, what are you talking about? Jorge replies that he knows exactly what the Pope is referring to. They were aware of the existence of priests and bishops, prominent men of the Church, who were abusing children. Jorge questions what was done about it. The Pope assures him they are addressing the issue. Jorge responds that the Church simply listened to their confessions and then moved those priests to another parish, where they continued committing the same abuses. The Church acted as though it was better to let 9 children suffer than to lose 9 million faithful in a scandal. The Pope is outraged and calls that idea grotesque. Jorge explains that those were the actual words of a bishop he consulted. The Pope asks what that bishop advised. Jorge reveals that the bishop recommended expelling the priest from the clergy and immediately initiating a canonical trial. He didn't believe in the supposed magic words of absolution as a solution. The Pope asks if that's how Jorge describes the sacrament. Jorge clarifies that while confession can cleanse the sinner's soul, it does nothing for the victim. Sin is a wound that must be treated and healed. Forgiveness alone is not enough. The Pope points out that Jorge is speaking in the plural, suggesting that he includes himself as partly to blame. He then mentions his own resignation as an act of protest against the Holy See. He brings up Jorge's desire to resign as Cardinal Archbishop and questions if he's even sure he wants to remain a priest, clearly disagreeing with much of what Jorge has said before walking away. A nun approaches Jorge and hands him his briefcase, informing him that the Pope has retired for the evening. She offers to show him to his room. Jorge, surprised, thought he was already supposed to leave the Pope's residence. At dinner time, the nun tells him that the Pope prefers to dine alone, but that the same meal has been prepared for him. After a simple but comforting dinner, Jorge is taken to a room where the Pope usually relaxes after eating. He turns on the television and watches a football match, becoming absorbed in the game. Soon, the Pope enters the room. Jorge tries to turn the TV off, but the Pope says it's unnecessary. Though he admits he doesn't understand the passion football stirs in people, Jorge insists that the Pope read the documents he brought, but the Pope, tired, says he's not in the mood and just wants silence. After a moment of shared reflection, the Pope expresses an intimate concern. He no longer knows what God expects from him at this stage of his life. He remembers that everything seemed easier when he was younger. He felt peace when he heard God's call, but now that clarity has faded. Inspired by the Pope's words, Jorge begins to recall his own past. The scene shifts to Buenos Aires, 1956. A young Jorge is dancing at a party with a woman. Later, he proposes marriage. But one day, as he's carrying a bouquet of flowers for his fiancée, he steps into a church. Without knowing exactly why, he just does. Inside, a priest sees him, approaches, and says he felt that morning that God was asking him to go hear confession. He waited for hours, and no one came, until Jorge entered. Jorge is frozen by those words. He had been asking God for a sign for years, and now, there it was, clear and direct. He admits it wasn't just that moment that served as the sign. It was the final push he needed. Deep down, he already knew. He just had to accept it. That same night, he meets with Amalia and tells her the news. He's entering the seminary. The Pope listens intently, but says that tonight is not the right time to talk about Jorge's retirement. He then sits at the piano and begins to play a piece of music, confessing it's been a long time since he played. Even though he once recorded an album, Jorge is captivated by the music, and memories of his past flood back. The atmosphere softens, and the Pope invites Jorge to share a glass of wine, allowing their conversation to flow more naturally. However, when Jorge once again tries to have the Pope sign his resignation, the Pope ignores him and changes the TV channel to watch his favorite show. Their conversation continues. The Pope admits he has felt very lonely, even though he knows God is with him. And with irony, he adds, God doesn't laugh. Eventually, he retires for the night. The next morning, while Jorge is enjoying his breakfast, he's informed that the Pope had an unexpected matter to attend to, and they must leave immediately. Just then, the gardener meets Jorge and gives him a small oregano plant, which brings Jorge great joy. Soon after, he's told the Pope is waiting for him at the helicopter. When they arrive, the Pope notices the oregano and comments on how popular Jorge is. He asks if there's a trick to being liked by everyone. Jorge sincerely replies that he just tries to be himself. The Pope smiles and says that when he tries to be authentic, people usually don't like him much. Later, Jorge tries to bring up the Pope's resignation again, but the Pope avoids the subject, not wanting to deal with it at that moment. Once in Rome, the Pope has urgent matters to attend to, and Jorge is told they'll speak the next morning. A car takes Jorge for a drive through Rome's charming streets before dropping him at his hotel. There, while watching TV, he discovers that a book has been published containing the Pope's private letters with his right-hand man, which is what caused his early return. Later that night, Jorge goes to a bar to watch the Argentina vs. Ecuador football match. During Argentina's victory celebration, Jorge offers a prayer for the Pope's well-being. But one fan comments that Benedict XVI deserves nothing. The next morning, the Pope sends someone to fetch Jorge, but the driver can't find him. Jorge has already left on a public bus. Upon arriving at the Vatican, Jorge is guided through a dark hallway that opens into a beautiful chapel where the Pope is waiting. The Pope asks what Jorge would have done if he had been elected Supreme Pontiff. He wants to learn more about Jorge's ideas and vision for the Church. The Pope firmly believes Jorge's visit is no coincidence. He had been waiting for a sign and praying. Now he feels ready to make a crucial decision. He reveals that he has decided to resign the papacy, and he believes Jorge is the right person to lead the Church. Shocked by this revelation, Jorge pleads with him not to step down, arguing that a pope must remain in his position until the end of his life, and that his resignation would cause irreparable harm to the Church. But the Pope is firm. He cannot grant Jorge's request to retire because a new conclave is approaching, and he is convinced that Jorge is the one who must guide the Church in these turbulent times. He explains that if he remains in power, he will only cause more harm. However, Jorge disagrees with the idea of coexisting with another pope. He considers the possibility unprecedented. The Pope, with a tone that blends seriousness and humor, reminds him that in the past there were even times when 3 popes existed simultaneously. He jokes that perhaps it's a German joke, but insists that the current situation might require one pope to be visible and another to operate from the shadows. He also reveals that his health is declining. He is nearly blind in his left eye and has a pacemaker. To govern, one needs clear vision, something he currently lacks. Jorge responds with concern, arguing that millions of believers around the world will demand an explanation for the resignation. If a clear reason isn't given, conspiracy theories and speculation will emerge, potentially damaging the Church even further. The Pope then confides in Jorge a secret he's kept hidden. When Jorge submitted his resignation, he, the Pope, felt a deep sense of relief, because his greatest fear was that Jorge would be chosen as his successor at the next conclave. But after getting to know Jorge personally, something in his perspective shifted. Though he disagrees with almost everything Jorge says, thinks, or does, he now understands that the Church needs someone like him. Jorge firmly insists that he cannot be Pope. There are parts of his past that, if revealed, would cause a great scandal. In the 1970s in Argentina, Jorge was the head of the Jesuit priests in the country. He was strict, demanding, and extremely conservative. One day, a woman approached him and confessed she had remarried. Jorge coldly told her that she hadn't truly married. She had merely shacked up, as the Church did not permit remarriage. That was Jorge, strictly bound to the rules, believing that was the only way to be faithful to his faith. But life had a rude awakening in store. The country fell into the grip of a brutal military dictatorship that persecuted, tortured, and disappeared anyone considered a threat. Activists, students, even priests. Some of those priests began to join the resistance. They spoke of social justice and denounced systemic abuses, but soon they began to vanish, one by one. In this turbulent context, Jorge, as superior of the Jesuits, felt responsible for protecting his community. So he made a critical decision to negotiate with the regime. He met with Emilio Massera, one of the dictatorship's leaders, and struck a deal. The priests would stop speaking about politics, burn dangerous books, and abandon all forms of social activism. In exchange, the regime would offer them protection. Jorge delivered this order to his superiors. They had to stop their activities in the poor neighborhoods and cease supporting the most vulnerable. However, 2 of his priests, Yalix and Yorio, refused to obey. They argued their duty was not to protect themselves, but to stand by those who suffered the most. They disobeyed Jorge's orders and continued their mission. Jorge then took an action that would haunt him for decades. He withdrew official protection from certain individuals. He didn't report or betray them, but he also didn't dare to defend them. As a result, the regime soon captured them. For months, they endured horrific torture. Their hands were broken, and their spirits were systematically shattered, both physically and mentally. Jorge began to deeply regret leaving them to their fate and tried to intercede on their behalf. He spoke again with Massera, but nothing he did proved effective. However, he did everything he could to help others. He smuggled people across borders, hid families in the seminary, and saved dozens of lives. Still, he always felt it wasn't enough. At the most critical moment, he had not risen to the occasion. He chose to stay on the sidelines, negotiating with power, instead of standing beside those who suffered. The Pope reminds him that dictatorships rob people of their freedom and rights. He recalls how the bodies of victims were thrown into the sea, only to wash up on the beaches later. When democracy was restored, Jorge was stripped of his authority and exiled to the mountains. There, he spent 2 years in deep introspection. hearing confessions, celebrating Mass, though he never felt worthy of preaching. Years passed. In 1998, during an international conference, two men interrupted his speech to accuse him of having supported the tyranny. However, his message caught the attention of a cardinal, who then named him bishop. Despite taking on this new role, Jorge renounced luxury and continued helping the poor, resuming the work that had once been denied to his fellow priests. The Pope reminds him that he is human, not a god, and advises him that he cannot change everything. He must believe in the mercy he preaches. At that moment, they're interrupted because people need to enter the chapel. Jorge asks the Pope if he's hungry, and he replies yes. Jorge suggests trying a nearby pizzeria, and the Pope's security team goes out to get pizza and soft drinks. During this intimate conversation, Jorge reveals that he's reconciled with some of his old companions, though not all. He's still seen as a controversial figure in Argentina. They then begin a Catholic confession. The Pope confesses that the Church has been aware of the child abuse committed by Father Maciel for years. Evidence was left on his desk, but he failed to act decisively. Jorge asks if he intends to resign because of this, and reminds him that now more than ever, the Church needs him to stay, to help heal that wound. Finally, Jorge absolves him of his sins. They decide to go out together, and Jorge asks if they should call security, but the Pope prefers to share a moment with the people. The moment of farewell arrives. The Pope asks Jorge if he remembers the story of St. Francis. When God told him to rebuild his church, Francis thought he meant bricks, but God meant something much greater. The Pope extends his hand, but Jorge embraces him instead. They laugh and part as true friends. 1 year later, Pope Benedict announces his resignation. The cardinals gather once again in the Vatican to elect his successor. Voting takes place, and Jorge Bergoglio receives the majority, becoming the new pope. The cardinals erupt in joy, knowing he represents the change the Church so desperately needs. Jorge reflects on his younger self, the one who doubted whether he should enter the seminary, who had to make difficult decisions. Now he understands. Every mistake and every struggle led him here, to serve the world and do more good than he ever imagined. He is led to the sacristy, the same one where, a year earlier, he had shared a pizza with Benedict. He calls the emeritus pope, but gets no answer. Benedict is watching the news, waiting to learn who will be his successor. As they prepare Jorge, he refuses the velvet cape, saying the carnivals are over. He also declines the jeweled cross and red shoes, choosing instead to appear in the plain white robes, the simple silver cross he's always worn, and his well-worn shoes. Then he takes a deep breath, says a short prayer, and walks out of the sacristy as Pope Francis I. When he finally appears on the balcony, the crowd erupts in applause. From their homes, millions of people celebrate the new Pope Francis, the first Argentinian pontiff. Next, we return to the opening scene of the film. A man is trying to book a flight over the phone. When he gives his name, Jorge Bergoglio, the person on the other end thinks it's a joke because it matches the Pope's name. Frustrated, Pope Francis steps outside and asks a guard to help him book the flight. The guard pulls out his phone and makes the reservation for him. He asks the Pope if he'll be traveling alone, and the Pope replies, yes. We then see Pope Francis traveling the world, bringing his message of hope and compassion to every corner of the planet. Finally, we witness a lighthearted reunion between Benedict and Pope Francis, where the two share a beer while watching a soccer match.